This is Booked on Rock. I'm Eric Senich. Our guest is Justin Quirk, author of Nothin But a Good Time, the spectacular rise and fall of glam metal. From 1983 until 1991, glam metal was the sound of American culture. This was the world stalked by bands like Bon Jovi, Kiss, W.A.S.P, Skid Row, Dokken, Motley Crue, Cinderella, Ratt, and many more. Big hair, massive amplifiers, drugs, alcohol, piles of money, and life-threatening pyrotechnics. Armed with hairspray, spandex, and strangely shaped guitars, they marked the last great era of supersize bands. Where did glam metal come from? How did it spread? What killed it off? And why does nobody admit to having been a glam metaller anymore? Justin Quirk seeks to answer all of those questions and more in Nothin But a Good Time. Justin is an award-winning writer, editor, and broadcaster from London. He first wrote for The Guardian's music pages when he was 19 and began contributing to Kerrang! Shortly afterwards as a reviewer. Since then, he's written for everyone from Arena and Esquire to The Times, Sunday Times, and The Independent about art, music, and culture. He regularly appears on the BBC World Service and Soho Radio, and DJs at places like Spiritland and Merchant's Tavern in London. To hear a playlist of the music discussed in this episode, head over to the show notes page. Justin, welcome to the Booked on Rock podcast. Great to have you here.
Thank you, Eric. It's my pleasure. Greetings from London to all your listeners out in the States.
So before we get to the book, let's get into your love of this era of music. When did you first become a fan? Was there a band or a song that really stands out as that defining moment when you became a fan of 80s glam metal?
What I didn't realize until later on was I was in exactly the right place at the right time. So I was born in 1976. So I turned 11 in 1987. So it's kind of, in this country, it's like a big shift time in your life. You move from your little primary school to your big secondary school. You start developing your own interests a bit more. And obviously what I realise now, looking back, is 1987 is kind of the annus mirabilis for, glam metal. It's, a lot of the big Bon Jovi stuff and the big Poison stuff. Appetite for Destruction obviously comes through. Hysteria by Def Leppard. Obviously, I didn't appreciate that context at the time. I'm 11. I started learning the guitar. You start getting exposed to this kind of stuff because you're buying guitar magazines. And then I had an older sister. And obviously, this is often the way. You pick up a lot of your musical taste through kind of older siblings who are a few years ahead of you. And a guy in her year gave me a dubbed cassette copy of Appetite for Destruction, which had just come out. To copy the tape, he'd drawn out the sleeve and everything for me. So the first track I heard was, track 1, side 1, Welcome to the Jungle. And that was it for me for sort of the next 5 years at that point. And I say what I realised now was if you were going to be into that kind of music, that period, 1987, as an 11-year-old boy living in a fairly boring suburb of a big city, you were just fire-hosed with this stuff. It just seemed like every 3 months there was something great coming out. It was just this steady stream of it. And, I was really lucky. A lot of people around me were into it. I was working in a guitar shop quite soon after. So, yeah, I was low-hanging fruit for this stuff.
So you're from London originally? Did you grow up in London?
Well, yeah, I'm from London. I mean, if you don't really know the geography, I'm from very, very southwest London. So I grew up in a place called Twickenham, which really, if you go like one train stop further, you're kind of out of the city limits. So it's like the very, very edge of suburbia. Twickenham's quite an interesting spot. It had the thing most people know it for is where the big rugby stadium is, where the England rugby team play. But back in the 60s and the early 70s, it had a very, very interesting musical pedigree because you're right on the River Thames. There's a big island in the Thames called Eel Pie Island. And my mum grew up around there. And it was slightly kind of lawless. It's an island, it's away from the mainland, but it had this old hotel on it where all these bands played in the 60s. So really from about 64, 65 onwards, everyone in the British music scene played there and came through. It was very countercultural. So my mum saw everybody playing there when she was a teenager. So, Kinks, Rolling Stones, the Yardbirds, The Who. And then as it moved into the early 70s, like Black Sabbath played there, early David Bowie shows there. So there was always a big sort of music scene around there. There's still kind of remnant, the Rolling Stones live around there. It's like that kind of area. But as a result, when my mum had very eclectic, sort of wide-ranging tastes that we were then exposed to as kids. So I think in terms of when I started to encounter music that was a bit heavier, a bit more alternative, a bit off the beat. You weren't hearing it in the pop charts. I'd already had, from as early as I can remember, we were kind of steeped in quite a wide range of fairly experimental music at home. So I had open ears for this stuff.
I was born in 72. I remember coming home after school and watching the Quiet Riot video for Come On Feel the Noise, the early Def Leppard videos like Photograph and Foolin' and Rock of Ages. It's a great time.
The key difference there for you guys was almost nobody in this country had MTV until maybe, I remember as late as maybe 91, 92. It was still a novelty,
really?
If anyone you knew had.
That late?
There was almost no cable system in this country. There was some people had satellite dish systems, but they were really unreliable. They were bulky. They had to be on the side of your house. There wasn't like a fixed cable network until early mid 90s, where it was really widespread. So all that, you say that kind of Quiet Riot era, sort of maybe 83 to 87. And I write a lot about MTV in the book because I think obviously, the story of MTV and the story of Glam Metal are intrinsically linked. You can't pick them apart, I don't think. But we really didn't have any of that in this country. Our only route really into metal of any kind, and glam metal specifically, was through the weekly music papers. So Kerrang, Metal Hammer, Raw later on was a good one. And then a couple of specialist radio shows. There was the Rock War on Radio 1 on Friday nights, a couple of local shows on Greater London Radio, but very, very little. So while in some ways that sort of hindered how widely disseminated the music was, I think for me, and probably people like me, it also massively added to its allure because, you grow up in this thing, England in the 80s, very run down, the economy was flat on its back, huge unemployment rates, everything's really run down. It was kind of getting where like New York had been in the 70s. We were at that level of kind of recessionary economics. And so anything American always seemed, bigger, more glamorous, more exciting. And the fact that it seemed like this slightly kind of hidden world that you only got sort of 3 months too late through magazines and imports and things added to its allure, I think, in some ways. It seemed impossibly glamorous. Like I say, I was, an adolescent boy in what I felt was a really boring kind of non-event suburb of a big city. And, and I think that's, even if you go back to a lot of the bands in question, very few of them were from LA. If you look at someone like Guns N' Roses, okay, like Slash was from LA. The rest of them were all blow-ins from other places. Poison came from other places. Motley Crue came from other places. And I think there was something that universally about the music spoke to people that felt like they were on the outside of things. You're on the edge of the city, you're on the suburbs, you're sort of missing out on life. And the music sort of gave you a promise of some potential that you might be able to access that.
One question I wanted to ask you about, because you write it in your book, you failed to get into an AC/DC video as an extra. Which video was that?
Yeah, it was the video for Are You Ready off The Razor's Edge. So again, looping back to the point about Twickenham, there's a lot of film industry work in this area. So I still live around here. There's a lot of like studio lots and Shepperton Studios where they made a lot of the famous British films in the 60s that listeners might be familiar with. All the old Ealing comedies, were filmed in this area. And a lot of it still gets used for pop video recordings. And I remember seeing a story in Kerrang, and they said AC/DC are filming their new video for single Are You Ready? I think it would be a Friday morning. And I don't know if anyone remembers, it was the second single, I think, of The Razor's Edge, which is kind of a patchy album. I mean, it's like a lot of the AC/DC albums post Blow Up Your Video. There's a lot of filler on them, but there are 2 or 3 really solid singles. So the first one was Thunderstruck, which is obviously a sort of timeless AC/DC track. The second one was Are You Ready? And the promo poster for it was a guy with his head shaved from behind with the AC/DC logo cut into the back of his head, into the clippers. So they said in this video, we're looking for people to have their heads shaved in the video and get the logo put into their hair, but we'll need other extras as well. And I was like, oh man, it's Friday morning. And I was coming up to my exams, I was 15, and I was a good student, I was hardworking. And my dad was a teacher, so we took education very seriously. And right up until the Thursday night, I was like, oh, I'm going to go. Well, why not? And then I bottled it on the Friday morning and I didn't go. And my friend John, who was far more cavalier about these things than me, just swerved off school completely. He went down there. He was right at the front, so I think you can just about see him in the video to this day. And he said it was an absolute blast, and they gave everyone these life-size cardboard Gibson SGs to kind of wave in the air as like a prop in the video. He still got his like framed up on his wall somewhere in his flat. So I never quite forgave myself for that. And I was like, do you know what? I should have just had the courage of my convictions and bailed out of school that day. But he did, and he said it was fantastic.
Oh, man, what could have been? What could have been? The Motley Crue video for Wildside has in the audience a very young and not yet famous Shannon Hoon of Blind Melon.
Wow.
Before he teamed up with Axl. You talked about Guns N' Roses guys being from different areas. Axl from Indiana. He helped Shannon Hoon and Blind Melon. But yeah, you could have been, hey, there I am.
I could have been the Shannon Hoon. Who knows? But I think that point you make is really interesting about, the Indiana link. And obviously I write about Guns N' Roses a lot in the book, because I think in some ways, in the entire kind of glam metal story, I think they're the most important band, not because just of what they produced in terms of the quality, but I think ultimately they're the band that break apart the entire sort of scene and the movement. So I think they're both sort of emblematic, but also key to its downfall. But I think that kind of outsider mentality in the Indiana link is so key to their entire identity and what shaped, the work they came out with. And I'm a huge defender of them still as a band. And I think they occupy a very odd position in that certainly in this country, like you very rarely hear them nowadays. And for the number of records they sold and the quality of those records and how many people were into them, they seem to have been sort of somewhat erased from public memory in a way that, bands who were much smaller at the time, you seem to sort of hear a lot more. And I've not quite worked out in my head as to why that is, but I think they're long overdue a very, very serious reassessment.
Ozzie Osbourne said they could have gone on, if they stayed together, they could have gone on to be as huge as, I think he said as huge as maybe the Beatles or Zeppelin, if they kept going.
It's a really interesting question, because I don't know when you would possibly have seen them around these same tours. I mean, I saw them twice on the Use Your Illusion tour. So we saw them, that was basically 91, 92. So I saw them twice at Wembley Stadium just before the albums came out, and then a year later. So the gig at Wembley I saw them with was the last gig that Izzy Stradlin ever played with them, which obviously we didn't know at the time, but he quit the next day. And they were incredible. There was still, with the exception of Steve Adler, it was basically the original 5-piece. Really heavy show, really hard, brilliant set. And there'd been bootlegs going around that we'd had for about 6 to 9 months of demo versions of what became Use Your Illusion, mainly just piano demos, but it meant we kind of knew the songs, they were playing them. But it was the first time you'd heard them in their fully sort of fleshed out version. And we thought, man, this is great. And it was such a good lineup. And it was them, I think, Skid Row and going to say Nine Inch Nails, I think, were opening up that day.
You might be right.
Really, really good show. And then a year later, they came round again. And by that point, like Izzy Stradlin had left. There was like basically a full orchestra and kind of brass section playing with them, all the backing singers. It was really bloated. And it was a very, you wanted it to be great, and it just wasn't really. And seeing them, twice so close together in such different circumstances, you sort of felt then you could sort of feel it shaking apart under the weight of its own ambition, really. I think, there was that stage where, I remember reading about when Peter Green sort of broke up Fleetwood Mac. And obviously, there was a mental health issue there. But he said, he got to this point where he just said, I had this music in my head which I wanted to create, and the people around me just weren't capable of it. And I feel like there was possibly an element of that with Axl at the time, that, he had this sort of huge sprawling ambition, which went, beyond well beyond glam metal. I mean, beyond even what you could really term as metal. I mean, it was something much bigger. It didn't really sound like anything else. And I don't really know who could have realized that for him. And I think in some ways, without wanting to, play armchair psychologist on him, I feel like what he's been through in maybe the last 20 years is a sort of long process of trying to find people that can recreate that sound that he has in his head. And then I saw him with AC/DC a couple. Did you see any of those shows when he toured with AC/DC?
No, I haven't. And I'm going to say I regret to say that I've never seen Guns N' Roses live. Never. And I wish I did. But you saw them when they were arguably the biggest band in the world in 91.
Hands down.
Yeah.
There was no one was close at that point.
Right. But I did not see Axl. Just from what I saw on the internet and YouTube, he sounded awesome with AC/DC.
You know what? He absolutely killed it. I wasn't going to go because I'm often quite wary about the nostalgia circuit and the retro thing. And I love AC/DC. I love Guns N' Roses. And me and a friend of mine, the writer Andrew Muller, went together. Both huge fans of both bands. And we were kind of walking up to the venue, going, "Do you know what? Like, if this sucks, it has the potential to really suck." Right. And it was making me think of the episode of King of the Hill where Bobby gets really into Christian metal, and Hank saying to me, he's like, "Son, like, you're not making anything better. You're just taking two great things and making them both worse." And I was thinking, like, look, this has the potential to be really, really dire. And within 30 seconds, we were both like, "No, this is going to be good." And his voice, because he hasn't gigged his voice out, he has essentially the voice he had 20 years ago. He hasn't been blowing his voice out doing 200 gigs a year or Vegas residencies or whatever. The voice is in a higher register, so he can do all the early AC/DC stuff that Brian Johnson can't really handle. And the thing that was most noticeable of all was he just looked incredibly happy to be there, in a way that I've never seen him look in any performing environment, because it wasn't his show, it wasn't his music. There were very tight parameters around what was expected of him and what he had to do. And I've got to say, he just nailed it to the floor for 2 hours. He was absolutely brilliant.
It would be interesting to see if they ever release those shows, audio, video, both. That would be interesting.
I would be really interested to see that. And me and my friend both also said the energy on those shows felt like you could actually have imagined new material coming out of that, which was worth listening to.
Yeah.
They both seemed completely energized by each other's presence. And it kind of pointed, obviously I write in the book about, well, what remains of glam now? What remains of that metal scene? And there's obviously, there is a nostalgia circuit, but in terms of who managed to move it forwards into something more contemporary, that was one of those things where I thought, do you know what, something really creatively worthwhile could come out of this. It wouldn't just feel like, a marriage of convenience. It actually felt like something that could have been aesthetically very, very productive.
Yeah, it never happened. There was talk that maybe they would, and then Brian Johnson comes back and AC/DC comes back. Real quickly, too, just to get back to the differences between Axl and the rest of the band in the early 90s, Slash was the guy really that he wanted to just stick to that early Guns N' Roses sound, that raw, straight-ahead rock and roll, and Axl didn't want that. And as you see, Chinese Democracy is where he wanted to go. Slash didn't want to go there. I don't know about Duff and the other guys, but I know Slash was the one who he just couldn't get behind that stuff at all. And I
guess it's not uncommon in about, that creative tension that exists between the lead guitarist and the singer is, you'd find that in the Stones, the Beatles, the Kinks. Certainly it's not uncommon. And like I said, I think by the time I saw them in that last show, you couldn't really see how those inherent contradictions were going to hold together. And I think it lasted for longer than I would have expected it to. But they obviously had very, very different visions for where they wanted that to go.
Well, and surprise, surprise, Guns N' Roses returns, right? They get Axl, Slash, and Duff, and this reunion has continued, and it's huge, and it's massive, and surprise, surprise, Axl showed up on time for all those AC/DC gigs, and that was another question. Angus probably would have been like, "You're showing up on time. You're not showing up late for this."
This may be urban myth or apocryphal, but I did hear at the time, and there's nowhere backing this up, was obviously there's no flies on AC/DC as a business organisation. And I heard from a couple of people that was essentially written into his contract was you're there on time every night and you're paid at the end of the tour, conditional on gigs being completed in a timely fashion. And I can well believe that. But it'd be interesting to know if that was actually urban myth or reality.
Yeah, interesting. So let's get to the book. Let's get to the roots of glam metal. When do they begin and with who?
There's an interesting line. I mean, glam rock in the British 70s sense is an interesting genre because in this country, it's huge. I mean, it has proper crossover mainstream appeal. You know, like bands like Slade had #1 records here. You know, they were proper like mainstream crossover chart bands. You know, Mott the Hoople had huge records. Bowie, to some extent, huge records. Mark Bolan, T-Rex, all this stuff there was big crossover. None of it really landed in America to the same extent. You know, even what we would think of in this country as the really top draw of British 70s glam rock didn't really hit commercially. You know, even like David Bowie and Mark Bolan's biggest singles in the States at the time, top 30, top 40. I mean, they're not huge acts at all. But what I think you get is they connect with a very small group of the right kind of people. So what you start seeing is people like Blackie Lawless from W.A.S.P, later of W.A.S.P, were very clued up to what they were doing. Kiss obviously were, you know, au fait with what they were doing. And it's a bit like, you know, when people talk about the Velvet Underground and they say, look, they only sold 1,000 albums at the time, but all of those people went on and formed a band. I kind of feel like that about British glam rock in America in the 70s is had a very small audience. They all went on and did something interesting. So I sort of feel like the kids who were clued up to what people like Bowie and Bolan were doing in the mid-70s were then forming their own bands in 81, 82, 83 and building something around that. So I think there's a link there. One of the things that I think held British glam rock back in America was it was quite androgynous in parts. And I think American tastes were not really into that for the most part. So, and, you know, I think you see that later on also with bands like Queen. You know, the more flamboyant end of Queen didn't really connect with American audiences. I think it was certainly a big part of why Freddie Mercury was never openly out as a gay man when, you know, a huge part of their market was in the States. It's a more kind of heteronormative, you know, market. Pretty remains so to this day. So I think what you had in the mid-70s was a band like Kiss picked up, and Alice Cooper, I think to a large degree as well, picked up on what made British glam interesting, but they kind of sanded the more scary edges off it slightly and did it in a way that worked for an American audience and did that brilliantly. You know, I think that the Kiss are kind of a cottage industry in their own right. I mean, they're sort of a phenomenon, you know, without, you know, they sort of function in their own kind of universe. So I think there's obviously a line you can draw from, you know, the like sort of $1 Billion Babies era, you know, Under My Wheels era, Alice Cooper, through Kiss. There's bits and pieces in the late 70s, you know, some of the things that come off like the Rainbow and the Deep Purple Family Tree, you know, they kind of sound a bit like glam, but they don't look like glam. And then there's other things that are probably coming out of punk that, like, you know, the New York Dolls maybe, where they look like glam, will look, but they don't really sound like glam. And the point I make in the book is that glam metal is both a musical but also a visual medium. Yeah, the visual aspect of it is incredibly strong. So I was saying, you know, the importance of MTV can't really be overstated in this case. And where I bookend the book is it starts really, in terms of the glam era, for me, it's probably the second Motley Crue album, in that I think that's the first record where everything coalesces, in that it sounds like a glam record, but it also looks like a glam record. And I think from then on, I think the stuff Quiet Riot were doing around that point is massively important as well. I think Quiet Riot were kind of a proof of concept. I think it was Geffen who signed them originally. And I think they were the one where the majors realised that there was a commercial scene there that was much bigger than they realised. Quiet Riot, you can clearly draw a line from like what Slade were doing in the 70s to what Quiet Riot were doing later on. Kevin DuBro's voice is very, very close to Noddy Holder's. They obviously covered, a Slade track. And I think from there, the floodgates really open. And then the third tier of that, I think the figure who's really, you can't overstress his importance in terms of bridging the 70s and the 80s is Ozzie Osbourne. If you look at like what Ozzie was doing with Black Sabbath, when he kind of relocated to the States in like the early 80s, Diary of a Madman, Blizzard of Oz, and Bark at the Moon. I think those 3 albums are when he starts to sound like an American act. The stuff he's doing with Sabbath. Sabbath is, this kind of very bleak British kind of death trip music. It's very heavy, it's very stodgy. I love Sabbath, but, it is what it is. What Ozzy reinvents himself as with that, when he starts working with American musicians, it's much tighter, it's much focused, it sounds much more radio friendly. The playing, it's faster, it's a bit harder. He surrounds himself with, very judiciously chosen musicians. Randy Rhoads, most obviously, but the rhythm sections he works through are incredibly tight. The whole look of those albums, and so I think Ozzy kind of shows how he kind of sets that template in a way. So I think he's hugely important for bridging that gap. But I think for me, that's really how it all kicks off in terms of moving from the 70s into the 80s.
The Booked on Rock podcast will return after this. Kiss is an interesting part of this story because there's the 70s Kiss, the original Kiss, who you say was a relatively meat and potatoes rock band with the spirit of British glam. But in the 80s, they found themselves following the glam metal trend rather than leading the trend. What role does the early Kiss play in all of the bands that come out in the 80s, the very bands who Kiss started to emulate?
Kiss is huge. And I think what Kiss is partly because I think Kiss connected really well in their first iteration with quite a young audience. You often hear people, like there's guys my age I know, who grew up in the States, and I'm like, when did you first get into Kiss? And they're like, I was in like, primary school, elementary school, I was a little kid. There was something about them that was kind of cartoonish and exciting. And, they had like the action figures. And I say in the book, Kiss are sort of, as much as they're a band, they're a kind of pyramid selling scheme. They've got this kind of entire universe that you can buy into, and you're part of the Kiss army. And to this day, I remember interviewing Iron Maiden about 10 years ago on a tour, and one of their road crew sort of making the comment, and he just said, the one band you never want to be on the same bill as is Kiss, because their crowd is so partisan, and guys who have come to see Kiss have come to see Kiss. Like they don't, to the exclusion of anything else. Like they don't want to hear anyone else, they don't want to see anyone else. You're not going to get a fair hearing. So I think they had a really deep connection in their first iteration with, what became the generation that then formed all these glam bands later. But what Kiss are what makes them really interesting in the 80s is they're emblematic of this phenomenon where 70s bands who'd inspired all these younger bands then ended up kind of rebooting themselves more in the image of the younger bands and getting a kind of second go around. So Kiss being, I think, probably the most obvious. Kiss of sort of like Destroyer and Detroit Rock City era versus Kiss of Lick It Up era is two very different propositions. Heart, I think, did exactly the same thing. Heart, again, if you compare Heart, a really kind of folk rock band in the 70s, and then how they came back with, Brigade and Bad Animals and all those kind of, big, sort of glossy glam records in the 80s. Aerosmith, I think, to a degree, rebooted themselves very much, when they're working with Bob Rock and Desmond Child and those guys up at Clear Mountain. Again, Aerosmith as an 80s band sound like a glam band, and they're very much following in the steps of younger bands who they inspired. And I think, again, to ladder back to the MTV point, I think what happened when MTV kicked in and music became much, much more visual, you had two things happen. You had this entire strata of bands who were still big bands commercially, but they did not work visually. and they just got kind of wiped off the map. So an example would be someone like Supertramp. You know, Supertramp is still releasing big selling albums up to about 81, 82. Supertramp do not work visually, and their career kind of grinds to a bit of a halt at that point. Conversely, you get a band like ZZ Top, who from 72, 73 onwards have essentially released the same record about 5 times. Great records, but, you know, they're ploughing a kind of furrow. And they reboot themselves for MTV because they have this great image, this really cartoonish look. They have a very strong grasp of visual aesthetics. So for some bands, MTV is a complete death knell. For others, it gives them this second bite of the cherry. So there is this whole swathe of these kind of 70s bands. Whitesnake would probably be a good example as well. You know, Whitesnake, really slower kind of blues rock band, very British in the 70s. When Coverdale kind of reinvents them around 85, 86 maybe, they become an American band. And the sound changes accordingly. And you get sort of, it's like Mark II of all these bands. So, like you say, there's just like an odd kind of Mobius strip where older bands inspired the younger bands, who then gave the older bands a template to tap back into, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, that's the craziest thing about Kiss is here they are emulating these bands who looked up to them. And you would Kiss, and the thing about the 80s is having guys that looked like chicks. I mean, that was the look. And you think, well, you know, so Kiss was a little too comic bookish with the makeup, but yet there they are in the 80s and they're all dolled up and they're wearing the loud outfits, and Gene was lost, but Paul Stanley, he really steps forward as the front man and he plays that role so well. It was like he was made for the 80s, thankfully, and he's the one who really helped keep that band alive.
Yeah, I mean, Kiss, they're kind of an easy band to, you know, ridicule in some ways. Their output has been patchy at best at times. But I think, as you say, particularly to Paul Stanley, you've got to give credit that, you know, whatever it took, they kept that band going. They kept them as a going concern. They're bigger now probably than they've ever been. I mean, I was finishing the book off in, I think, the autumn of 2019, and I was looking at like the gross figures for the tour that they just completed. It's staggering. I mean, the appeal they still have, and they're still bringing new fans on board. And at some point, you've got to say, do you know what? Most bands didn't manage that. And whatever holes you could pick in the quality of some of their output, they did whatever it took to keep that band going. And like I say, Paul Stanley, I think, particularly deserves credit for that at various points.
By the time the 80s arrived, Kiss was over and done. They were buried. It was just a matter of closing the casket. Somehow they rebounded. They lost a lot of their fans with I Was Made for Loving You, with the disco hit. They come back with Music from the Elder, Bombs. Then they return with a hard rock album, Creatures of the Night, which is awesome. But by that point, everybody's checked out. They're playing half-empty arenas. They needed to do something drastic, and they take the makeup off. But they also needed hit singles, and they came up with them. And that's one thing about Kiss in the 80s. They managed to have a hit single from each and every album they released in the 80s. Lick It Up had Lick It Up. Animalize had Heaven's on Fire. Asylum, Tears Are Falling. Crazy Nights takes a lot of hits. I like Crazy Nights. Crazy Nights was big where you are, in Europe.
And the
single was huge.
That was really when they came back over here because we didn't have MTV, those 3 previous albums, those singles didn't really land over here. And also, you know, because Kiss hadn't been huge here in the 70s, so it wasn't even really like they had the nostalgia aspect of, you know, it wasn't like, you know, when, I don't know, Animalize or Lick It Up came out, there was pretty people like, oh, I remember these guys when I was a kid, you know, they came back. They didn't really have that kind of brand recognition over here. So Crazy Nights, that was like that was a big radio hit, like a mainstream radio hit over here. And that really brought them back in a big way here. It landed with an audience who I don't think realized how far back they went. You know, so I think it almost introduced them as kind of a new band again. And you got to say, it still absolutely slams as a single. People will still be listening to that in 20, 30 years' time. It's a great record.
How important is Quiet Riot's Metal Health? Because that's the first ever metal album to hit #1. And that was 1983. That's huge right there. That's when things start to really take off.
Do you know what? That's also, I mean, that's a really, really good album, which, I mean, obviously the single is massive. I mean, that would be in my all-time top 5, top 10 classics of the metal singles.
Come On, Feel the Noise?
That wouldn't make, I mean, mainly because it's a cover, but I think Bang Your Head, that's like an absolute Hall of Famer. Brilliant video. The vocal performance on it is incredible. But I think as interesting as they are musically, like I say, I think they get slightly written out of things sometimes. Like, that's not an album you hear that often. You go back and listen to it. I mean, if anyone hasn't stuck it on for a while, it really stands the test of time, I think. But the thing that came out quite strongly when I was researching the book was how significant they were in terms of the actual major record labels glomming onto this. Because there was obviously a scene that was developing around LA, and again, quite right, not to the same extent as Kiss, but they were really a 70s band that had been through a couple of iterations, were kind of dead in the water at one point. It was essentially whatever was legally trading as Quiet Riot at one point. Bit of a revolt. They were kind of they were a bit of a kind of like finishing school for other bands. People tend to be in Quiet Riot for a little bit, like Randy Rhoads, whatever, and then go on and do something better. But then there was obviously that scene that was building up around LA. And then I think it was, correct me if I'm wrong on this, but I think Geffen that signed them. It was the first big sort of major signing for a band that were coming out of that Sunset Strip scene. And it was kind of proof of concept that I think them being signed by a major and repaying that investment opened the floodgates where suddenly everyone was like, well, actually, this can work. Because I think that scene had grown bigger than people had realised. And again, to harp on the MTV thing, when MTV starts getting relayed out into cities all over the country rather than just being a coastal thing, suddenly there's a way of channeling this music straight into communities that wouldn't have hit it otherwise. And you've really got a ready-made nationwide market there that's really hungry for this stuff. But yeah, Quiet Riot, I think, hugely important both musically and commercially. And I think somewhat unfairly written out of the story in many cases.
How important is Van Halen, particularly the Dave era, to glam metal?
I mean, I think if you read his extremely entertaining memoir, Crazy from the Heat, I think that similarity was not lost on David Lee Roth as to how many lesser artists have followed his wake. I mean, they're a difficult band to consider because on some level you listen to them and that first album when it comes out is just like a step change. There's elements of what they were doing and things that came before, but there's nobody really who sounds like Van Halen beforehand. There's nothing on that first album you go, okay, this sounds like whoever from 2 years ago. So to a degree, they kind of function in their own universe. No one's as good as Eddie Van Halen. No one's as good a frontman as Dave Lee Roth. Nobody sounds quite like them. Nobody looks quite like them. But they clearly inspire a lot of people. Now, where I think they're interesting as a band is that you listen to those early albums, and Henry Rollins, there's a really good, I think it's from Radar or Spin from a long time ago, where Henry Rollins interviewed Dave Lee Roth. And he makes the point that what they were doing around 76, 77, 78 has more in common with punk than it does with anything that was in the rock firmament. Those albums are really raw, brutal, aggressive, sonically as well. There's a real kind of just attack about them. And he says, if you put the first Van Halen album up against, say, the Sex Pistols album, one of those is clearly a heavier, rougher record than the other. It's the Van Halen one every time. And there's a way that they could have gone down that path and become sort of like heavier and rougher and even more brutal sounding. And then I think around those first few years of the 80s, they're obviously attuned to what's going on, the way the sound's developing, the way radio's developing, the way MTV's coming through. And they sort of pull up out of that sort of heavy, sort of arms race that they're in. And the sound changes as drastically as Ozzy does when he recruits that sort of American. So again, it's not as extreme as the Whitesnake shift, but it's almost like two different bands. If you compare the stuff around Jump to, you know, the stuff around Women and Children First, or, you know, those kind of albums. You're like, very, very different prospect. And the thing I thought was really interesting was, you know, Jump is obviously, it's overplayed, it's their biggest record, but it's their biggest record for a reason. You know, it's a brilliant, nailed-on pop single. And they clearly, you know, they weren't afraid of a crossover, you know, which often in subcultural music, there's often this thing where people are afraid of success. You know, they don't want to be Van Halen weren't like, you know, they always wanted to be the biggest. Dave Lee Roth always wanted to be bigger, better, you know, more out the front. And, you know, by God, he did it. But what I think is really interesting is that they're smart enough to go, okay, look, we need to shift our sound. We also need to shift our appearance. You know, they have a very, very strong grasp of the visuals. The album sleeves change, the kind of videos they start making. They're not afraid to adapt in terms of where the market is. They're not, you know, digging in and going, no, this is what we are. And you think when Jump comes out, you're releasing that single in, you know, I think 1984 when it comes out. You have the best, most celebrated heavy metal guitarist by a country mile in your band, and you build that your lead single for the album, you build it around a synth riff. Now, Jump, exactly the same song, but with that riff played on the guitar, that wouldn't have been the crossover single that it was. I'm convinced of that. And if you think, you know, like you were saying with like Kiss fans, when, you know, you think how heretical it was for certain rock audiences to even hear synthesizers, or, you know, to sort of, oh, you know, they're using drum programming, you know, later on, like the amount of like grief ZZ Top got around, say, Afterburner, because they were using click tracks and sequencers. There was a big chunk of your audience that didn't want to hear that stuff. And Van Halen are not just using it, they are foregrounding that stuff and going, the first thing you will hear for the first minute of this album is, you know, is an Oberheim OX7 or whatever that they're playing it on. And they're embracing that. And I think that's an interesting illustration of both how smart they were, what a nuanced understanding they had of the pop market, but also just how flexible they were. You know, I think they knew how to get their music out to as big an audience as possible. And it's a sort of eternal sadness, I think, that band fell apart when it did, because you think, well, they were both, you know, I think the solo records Dave Lee Roth did, I think were really good. I always really enjoyed them. There's bits about the later Van Halen records that I really liked. And I always felt they could have done more together if they could have. And again, we go back to your point about Slash and Axl. It's like, you know, what can you resolve those creative tensions, or does it just break it apart at a certain point?
Noah Monk, the former Van Halen manager, he managed the band throughout all those early years with Dave. He said if they stayed together, they would have been selling out stadiums by the end of the 80s.
But also because, like you say, they were coming through at a point when, at that point, the infrastructure for metal bands like that didn't really exist. You know, by the time Doc McGee's whole stable of bands is killing it all over the country, and not just the country, but all over the world. And that's, you know, one of the points I made. And there was sort of an inspiration for writing the book originally was the sheer size of this stuff. You know, heavy metal always cultivates this image of being a kind of outsider, renegade music. And I was actually going back and looking at old issues of Kerrang and looking at like the tour itineraries. And you look at, say, like Def Leppard's tour itinerary from 85, 86, 87, you're like, they're playing everywhere. They're selling out stadiums everywhere. They're in Japan. They're all over Europe. It's one of the few kinds of Western music at the time that properly gets into the Eastern Bloc, you know, in a way that most, you know, I had friends whose dads were in the army. They grew up in army bases in East Germany in the 80s. And they were like, all you heard was Iron Maiden, Scorpions, Bon Jovi, Van Halen. You know, this was in like rural army bases in, you know, the old Eastern Bloc. You know, it was massive in Latin America, all over North America, all over the UK. And like you say, had Van Halen been a few years later, that whole infrastructure of, you know, the touring setup and the management would have been there for them. And they could have been, oh, yeah, they were huge. I mean, they did really well, but they could have been even bigger because that network was there for them.
I think of bands like Poison and Bullet Boys, who, by the way, was produced by Ted Templeman, who produced all those early Van Halen albums. Those are the bands that followed the Van Halen with Dave era template. But then you also have the Led Zeppelin template, Led Zeppelin's important to this scene too, because the massive sound of John Bonham on drums, that sexy blonde frontman can hit the high notes, the charismatic lead guitarist, Jimmy Page, they have a huge influence on 80s rock.
Well, they were certainly in this country. I mean, Zeppelin's position is interesting because I think what people forget is when you go back and read the music press for the time, how much bad feeling there was towards them by the time they broke up. You know, they were seen as being this kind of relic. You know, they were the wrong side of punk. There was obviously, you know, the new romantic and the kind of, you know, new pop scene was coming through, which they obviously had no real connection to. Those last few albums, I think, have been, you know, things like In Through the Outdoor and Coda have been. Coda, I think, is a really underrated album, but I think they've latterly been reassessed. But at the time, they were seen as being, you know, kind of damp squibs. And I think their reputation sort of regrew quite gradually amongst musicians through the 80s. And then, like you say, you started seeing these bands who were clearly drawing on what they were doing. By about 85, 86. I mean, even people like, it's not an exact model, but, you know, people like Great White Lion, I think, you know, they were clearly more on the sort of more bluesy side of glam. You know, glam always had that kind of bluesy element to it. You know, bands like the Choir Boys a little bit later on, who, you know, they were pretty big over here. You know, they were kind of drawing on the Faces and the 70s thing as well. And then what really, I think, really supercharged that Zeppelin influence was there was a huge reissue campaign in about, I think, 89, 90. They did a box set called Remasters, and they reissued kind of everything. And really, up until that point, it was like you didn't hear much of them even on kind of classic rock radio. You didn't hear a lot of them. The albums weren't super easy to come by. And then I think around 89, 90, where they started this big reissue campaign, people sort of thought, oh, actually, yeah, there is something there worth going back to. And also because, you know, Jimmy Page and Robert Plant they themselves had kind of tried to distance themselves a bit from the band. You know, they made very different kinds of, you know, stuff like Outrider, you know, those kind of albums were very, very different kind of releases. The Live Aid performance, which, you know, was appalling, really, I think probably torpedoed their reputation for another couple of years there. But I think really it was musicians and bands who kind of rediscovered them throughout that decade. And then by like certainly the later glam period, I think like 89, 90, you kind of go, okay, there's clearly a huge Zeppelin influence coming through there again.
Ratt is another band, like Quiet Riot, who were around long before they became huge. They came from the Sunset Strip scene. Talk about Ratt and also that Sunset Strip era, because that was ground zero for glam metal in the 80s.
That was interesting with researching the book and going back and looking at that was firstly sort of really, you know, you realize like Ratt obviously say went back far further as like a 87, you know, 86, 87 band. And you're actually, they're almost a generation back on their peers. You know, they've been hacking around for a lot longer. I think musically, I've got to say, I mean, this may be a controversial opinion, but I felt going back and listening to those records again, I didn't think they held up as well as some of their contemporaries. I thought the production, often sounded a little thin. And I felt in some way they never quite had like the killer single. It always felt, I never felt like they quite followed through on their potential. I mean, that's a subjective thing from me. But what I think is interesting about them is I think like Quiet Riot, they were kind of a proof of concept for the industry. You know, I think when they got signed and suddenly went much, much bigger, was around that point where labels suddenly realized that the scene wasn't just 400 kids at Gazzari's or, you know, the Whiskey, that they realized that there was actually a much bigger network of fans and audiences spread across the country by that point. There was so much bigger you could tap into. And then to a degree, for that first year or two, I think the major labels were playing catch up on that. But I think Ratt and also Quiet Riot, like you said, were very important in that. The thing that really jumped out when I was going back and looking at their stuff was the first video for You Think You're Tough, which is off their first EP, the self-titled one, 83. The video is a really interesting example of how I was saying earlier, glam was as much a visual medium as a musical one. And Ratt, and I think this partly explains how well they did, I think were clued up to that from very, very early on. So in the video, you see them sort of driving around LA, they're encountering all these legions of fans, there are, you know, big photo shoots, there's a Marilyn Monroe lookalike. It's this sort of vision of like the rock star lifestyle, which is in some way in excess of where Ratt actually were living at that point. You know, it's sort of wish fulfillment in a way. It's sort of showing them as much bigger than they actually are. But I think what they realized was if we show ourselves at the level we're actually at, that's quite unimpressive. This is going to go out on MTV. So it's like an elephant flaring its ears up. You know, you make yourself look as big and intimidating as possible. And they do that with the video. And then also in the video, the other thing that's really significant is the guest appearances in there. Tommy Lee and Nikki Sixx crop up in there. Ozzie Osbourne crops up in there, all as extras. Ozzie is both himself and also a particularly disconcerting middle-aged woman that they've dressed him as for some reason. But you realise it's sort of a shorthand for showing that there's this network developing. And, you know, obviously later on, like, you know, Nikki Sixx moves in with Robin Crosby. You know, they sort of, you know, they're sort of literally in and out of each other's lives. But I think in that sort of 3 minutes in the video, both for a band saying, this is how we show the world how big we are, irrespective of whether or not we're that big. You know, it's that realizing that image is everything. And as I say, sort of throughout the book, this is what I think makes glam metal so fascinating, in that it's almost the most pure expression of a culture that I think dominated America in that decade, which was both visually led, but also kind of it was all about the supersize. Everything was bigger. Everything was kind of very steroidal and pumped up. And you see that across action films. The way that cable news became, you know, at the start of the decade, it's this very sort of small concern. By the end, it's like live 24-hour day coverage of Desert Storm 1. You know, everything gets bigger and bigger. People get bigger. It's sort of a culture getting sort of more and more pumped up, and the music feels like the ultimate expression of this. And to sort of take a bit of a step back from the specifics, this is what I found so fascinating about the book, and this is kind of what inspired me. Was, in a way, like, my target reader isn't just someone who loves glam metal. I think someone who loves glam metal, I hope, will enjoy the book. But I wanted to write something that people who hated glam metal could still read and get something out of, because I passionately believe that if you want to tell the story of America through the 1980s, you cannot do it without looking at glam metal and what it entailed, in the way that I think you would struggle to tell the story of the late 70s without looking seriously at disco. I think you'd struggle to tell the story of the late 60s without looking at, you know, the music that was coming out of the West Coast. You know, I think you get these periods where music is completely emblematic of what is going on around it, to a degree that it almost is immaterial whether or not you think the music is good, bad, indeterminate. And, you know, and a lot of people, there is kind of a shorthand that glam metal was like ridiculous, throwaway, popcorn kind of music. And my sort of two starting points for the book were like, well, I don't think that's true. I think, you know, it's like any genre. It had good and bad, and there's things that you can sift out of it. But I say mainly it was, I find the culture of that decade so fascinating. And I think if you're interested in how that decade shaped where we are now, which I think it did, I think you have to look at this music and everything that it embodied and it summed up and it represented in terms of the culture, because I think it's so revealing about where America was and what it was becoming. From 83 to 91, the transformation of the country is immense. And you can track that story through, from Motley Crue's second album to Use Your Illusion. You can draw that line and tell that story.
You nail it right there. As somebody who lived through that era, here in the U.S., the Reagan era, bigger is better. Yeah. Image is everything. That was on commercials. Image is everything.
And it's so true. And I think, you know, I mean, obviously I'm getting well off the music here, but, you know, I make this point in the book that, you know, and I'm old enough, you know, I'm a little younger than you, but I'm old enough to remember the Cold War. You know, that's kind of the defining fault line geopolitically of that period. You have the West on one side, the East on the other, and everything about the West is about making itself look bigger and the better ideological option of the two. Free market capitalism can give you this, you know, the freedom we have is this. That's what state socialism or communism offers you. And that builds up and builds up. And then suddenly by like 1990, one of those systems just ceases to exist. And I think, you're suddenly then in a position where you go, well, okay, we kind of, inverted commas, won. Our belief system won out. It's now time that we can take a look at ourselves. And I think to some degree, this is what someone like Axl Rose comes to embody. He's the sort of, him and the music he's making is sort of consumed with this sort of like aggression and rage and self-loathing. And I'm like, that's not the kind of fun party music that we've had from Bon Jovi 2 years earlier. There's clearly something's kind of shifted. And I think the analog, I say, in a way, if you look at, say, the way that the music of the 60s really darkened in about 69, 70, if you listen, like Hendrix doing the Star Spangled Banner or Neil Young doing On the Beach, that sort of post-Manson, the way that the 60s curdled into something quite bleak, I felt like you had something similar at the end of Glam Metal. You'd had this kind of 8-year party with condom vending machines on the tour bus and everything's a party and it never stops. And then by 1991, you look at where Guns N' Roses have ended up and the whole scene's kind of falling in on itself. And you think maybe that's tipping over into something darker as well.
The Booked on Rock podcast will return after this. Time to check out the new and upcoming Books on Rock releases. Just released this week through Permuted Press, Unchained, the Eddie Van Halen story by Paul Brannigan. The first full-length biography of Eddie Van Halen, a searching, affectionate, and in-depth look at the remarkable life of a genuine musical virtuoso who changed the course of rock and roll. Acclaimed biographer Paul Brannigan tackles the dramatic story with respect and affection for one of rock's greatest musicians, pairing original interviews with meticulous research to bring the story of Eddie Van Halen completely up to date. Also just released, David Bowie, All the Songs, The Story Behind Every Track, by Benoit Claire, through Black Dog and Leventhal Books. A lovingly thorough dissection of every album and every track ever released by David Bowie over the span of his nearly 50-year career. The book follows the musician from his self-titled debut album released in 1967 all the way through Black Star, his final album. This is a one-of-a-kind book drawing upon years of research in order to recount how each song was written, composed, and recorded, down to the instruments used and the people who played them, featuring hundreds of vivid photographs that celebrate one of music's most visually arresting performers. Due out January 10th through the History Press, Historic Connecticut Music Venues, from the Coliseum to the Shaboo, by Tony Renzoni. Connecticut is home to a number of landmark music venues that have featured local and national performers. While some of the locations have closed, they've certainly not been forgotten. The New Haven Coliseum, the Arena, and the Bushnell Memorial were once the places to be for music lovers, while elsewhere, places like the Cherry Shack and the Shaboo hosted local bands and national headliners. Other venues like the Foxwoods, Mohegan Sun, the Meadows, and Toad's Place have now taken center stage and continue to attract large crowds. With in-depth interviews with performers and many timeless photos, author Tony Renzoni takes you on a nostalgic and fun tour of the Nutmeg State's most beloved music sites. Due out January 11th through Red Planet Books, Dead Straight Guide to Queen by Phil Chapman. Few bands embodied the pure excess of the 70s like Queen. Theatrical, brilliant, even mercurial. There's never been another band like them, or a frontman like Freddie Mercury. This book tells the full story of the band and its members, from pre-Queen to post-Freddie. For a list of all the newest and upcoming Books on Rock releases, just head over to our website, bookedonrock.com. Nobody bigger than Bon Jovi and Def Leppard. When you talk Def Leppard, nobody had a bigger sound, the hysteria sound. We mentioned Ratt, and you listen to a song like I Want a Woman from 1989, or the follow-up album, they had a song called Lovin' You's a Dirty Job. You listen to those albums, they sound more like Def Leppard than they sound like early Ratt. But those two bands, not so much with Def Leppard, but Joe Elliott has said, didn't like being labeled a hair band. In fact,
no.
He's pointing out the fact that we weren't even from America. We weren't on the Sunset Strip. We were in the UK.
Yeah.
But Bon Jovi, John Bon Jovi in particular, he has distanced himself from that era so much. And you talk about huge album, Slippery When Wet, 1986, New Jersey, 1988.
Huge.
Do you agree with John Bon Jovi's decision to do that? Or should he have embraced it? Should he have some fun in concert with it? Dress up in that big, long, sparkly coat he wore in the video and just play the old videos up on the big screen and have a laugh at it. But he won't. He won't be in any books.
You're bringing it all back to. I think it was the second gig I ever went to was Bon Jovi on the New Jersey tour.
Okay,
I saw them in London at that show.
My favorite Bon Jovi album. Love New Jersey.
It's a great album, and again, it kind of gets forgotten to some degree because Slippery When Wet was so huge. But I would say actually going back and listening to those two albums side by side, New Jersey I think is the more solid album. Slippery When Wet has, those three enormous singles on it that have kind of a halo effect on the rest of the record. There's quite a lot of filler on Slippery When Wet. New Jersey, I think, is the more balanced piece of work. But they're both great records. It's interesting. I mean, one of the difficulties of writing about this, and, my book was obviously kind of research-led, so I wasn't having to interview people for it, was nobody wants to think of themselves as a glam band. Or a hair band, even artists who are so clearly hair metal bands will not describe themselves as that. Tiger Tails probably won't describe themselves as a hair metal band. Nobody, it's a completely pejorative term in the way that I think for a long time, like New Wave was. Nobody wanted to call themselves a New Wave band because it was seen as being this kind of trashy record company invention. I think the reason they can't have any fun with it is, I say in the book, one of the things that I think dates hair metal to some degree is that the band had a very strong sense of the ridiculous. Yeah, they're very theatrical, they're very over the top, but they took themselves incredibly seriously. They dressed in the way they did because they thought it looked good. It was part of the performance. What you have after about 1991 is that everything becomes very ironic and self-referential, and music develops a much stronger sense of kind of dramatic irony, and everything's kind of functioning on two levels, and it's all a bit, So I said, nowadays, if you saw a band turning up dressed like Poison, you would assume it was a joke.
Steel Panther.
Steel Panther, or kind of the Darkness to some degree when they came out over here. It looks like it's being played for laughs. And I think it's one of the things that we're a very sort of irony literate culture now. So I think for the most part, if you showed bands in their heyday, like, Motley Crue in their heyday, Poison, Warrants, all these sort of bands, if you showed them to a 14-year-old now, I think they'd sort of find it like ridiculous and anachronistic in a way that if you showed them a band who had a sense of irony back then, like Talking Heads or Blondie or someone, they would understand that. There will still be bands today who look and sound like Talking Heads. Whereas I feel like the glam thing feels slightly frozen back in that period in a way that it looks kind of as anachronistic as skiffle or something. It looks like something from a bygone era. And so I think that's made it very, very difficult for bands to go back and reassess that legacy in a kind of meaningful way. And I think the ones who survived basically did what Aerosmith and Bon Jovi did, which was kept their heads down for about 2 or 3 years, cut their hair shorter, and then came back with, a black and white photo on the cover and slightly more serious lyrics.
I could certainly understand that. I totally understand that. But like John Bon Jovi may be the only one, at least the only one that I know of, where he won't even allow himself to be quoted for a documentary or a book on it. All those other guys. I mean, David Lee Roth would be the type of guy, he'll look back on it and he'll say, the 80s was a great time, ignorance is bliss. That was his quote when he talked about the 80s, and just have fun. I mean, at least there's no harm in being part of some kind of a documentary or a book. Or I'm trying to think of the book that was just out recently where the author said they approached John about it, and it had to do with the glam band era in the 80s. And he just said, nope, not going to do it.
It's probably, there's a book that came out just after mine with the same title that's like an oral history of, it may well have been that. I think that's a very, very good book. But I think in John Bon Jovi's case particularly, he's an interesting one in that, they were so clearly a glam metal band, but even going back and reading contemporaneous interviews with him from like 88, 89, 90, he was very very wary of being labelled as that. And he was always very keen to be like, no, we're much more in the tradition of like Springsteen or that sort of more kind of like classic American singer-songwriter stuff. And by about, I think like 89, 90, when he's doing like the solo record and the Young Guns soundtrack, he seems very, very miserable about the whole thing. And, you know, it's like the sort of interviews where he's like verbatim quoting back negative reviews he's had of live shows and things. And, you know, he seems very, very hung up on how they're perceived by other people. I think in a way that I get the impression someone like Richie Sambora wasn't. You know, I think he was much more accepting of their place in the scheme of things. But even going back to those old interviews, I was surprised at how much John Bon Jovi wanted to, I think, be seen more as part of something more in like the great American songbook tradition.
And I could certainly understand it because I'm a huge fan of Bon Jovi's body of work. And I think there's some legit songwriting there, particularly with New Jersey. It's bluesy. The songwriting is very much in the vein of a Bruce Springsteen type. So I understand where he's coming from on that. I certainly can understand it. But
looking back, you know, that was, I don't know how much the whole glam metal thing was almost like a flag of convenience for them. You know, because like you say, you could imagine retooling a lot of those records from New Jersey and Slippery When Wet. Had they been recorded differently, you could have imagined them sounding more like the E Street Band. And, you know, having them. So I think to some degree, you know, maybe it was just something they adopted because, look, if you wanted to get on MTV in 1986, you needed to, you know, hit the ground running. The hair needed to be big. The duster coat needed to be floor length. You needed, as at the show I saw, you needed to be getting blown through the floor of the stage in a wall of fireworks at the opening of the gig. You know, they did that really, really well. And, you know, you can't fault them for, you know, and like I say, those records, I think when you look back at the records that stand the test of time from that period, the Bon Jovi ones certainly do. I say the obvious the Van Halen ones do, but I think they're kind of their own thing. I think the Skid Row records hold up really well. I think they were massively underrated. You know, there's bands like even, you know, for all the grief they got, I think there's some of the recordings that, you know, someone like Warren did. I think, you know, something like Uncle Tom's Cabin is a brilliant record. But,
okay, I'm glad you said that. I was going to ask you about that because I got the feeling from reading your book, maybe you weren't a fan, but now, okay. So you're a fan. That's another one. I think Jani Lane was a legitimately good songwriter and a tragic story. He's no longer with us, but a really good songwriter. That Cherry Pie album, and he even said that whole album was done without Cherry Pie the single. The rest of that album is so good, and he wishes that album would have it was going to be called Uncle Tom's Cabin too. That was the name of the album.
I mean, they're a really interesting case because they really come through right at that tipping point where the genre is starting to run out of steam. And I think I say in the book, you know, they're one of those bands where that whole thing around them in the Cherry Pie video, if people who don't really know much about glam metal but hate glam metal, if you ask them to picture describe what they're envisaging, it's basically Warren circa Cherry Pie. You know, it's like everything that people dislike or think they dislike about the music and genre just compressed into 3 minutes. And particularly in this country, it was the only record of theirs that crossed over. So to all intents and purposes, the only thing, realistically, the only thing I knew about them at that time was Cherry Pie. And as you say, it's probably not that representative of them as a whole, but it became this sort of albatross in the way that, you know, a big selling, slightly novelty single does for a band, completely obscured all the other stuff they did, and then meant that really a year later, when fashions changed very, very quickly, they were, I think, just impossibly tied to the past. There was no hope of kind of reinvention for them in a way that they probably actually had the music, or he certainly, I think, had the musical skills and the songwriting skills where he could have done that. And then, as you say, just this genuinely tragic end, denouement to his sort of life and his career. And, you know, the kind of end you really wouldn't have wished on anybody. And you think, you know, it could have panned out very, very differently for him. But, you know, it's a very, very cruel industry. And a lot of people, in the way that when MTV kicked in, a lot of, you know, we're saying those older bands had their careers ended overnight. 10 years later, a lot of these bands that had been really dominant in the 80s I think, turned up at record companies who suddenly just had no interest in them, didn't know where to place them. The radio outlets for them had dried up. They were a bit of a laughing stock. And what do you do at that point? I mean, there's, I think Dave Sabo from Skid Row says that, after Seb Back left, they put out a couple of decent records. They still were making interesting recordings. And he just said, look, by 1995, it made no difference what we put out. We could have put out the best thing we'd ever recorded and just nobody wanted to hear it. There was no audience there for it. There's a thing I found around the same period. I think Motley Crue were playing in somewhere like Pasadena and sales were a bit sluggish for the gig. So like, look, we're literally giving out free tickets. Any kids come down to the radio station, we'll get free tickets right now. Like 2 people turn up. And I think for a lot of those bands, that come down was very, very hard. You have to be sympathetic to, you're not doing anything differently. The world's just changed around you in very, very short order.
Have you listened to Warrant's album, the follow-up to Cherry Pie? That was in 1992, Dog Eat Dog.
Yeah, that's the one where they tried to go a bit more sort of grunge type, isn't it? Is that the one?
No, that was, I think, the next one, which was Ultraphobic. Machine Gun's on there, The Bitter Pill. There's a great song called Hole in My Wall. That's a very good album. But again, this was when Pearl Jam and Nirvana was starting to come out, and they were getting airplay for Machine Gun, at least here in the States, and The Bitter Pill, I think, got some radio play. But it's a really good album. There's another one called Hollywood So Far So Good. There are some very good albums by those bands in the 90s that just nobody ever even had a chance to listen to, which is unfortunate. Nothing But a Good Time, The Spectacular Rise and Fall of Glam Metal by Justin Quirk is out now. And unfortunately, there was a dark side to this era when these musicians took that life of excess too far. Think of Vince Neil's car crash in 1984. His friend Razzle from the band Hanoi Rocks died in that car crash. So there were times when things got pretty dark.
I mean, that's the intrinsic part of the story. When we say, the Vince Neil story is terrible. There's obviously in this country, we had the Donington Monsters of Rock disaster in '88 where some kids were trampled to death during the Guns N' Roses set. Robin Crosby from Ratt, with his sort of demise. I mean, some terrible, terrible stories there.
Nikki Sixx almost lost his life. He says he died. He flatlined.
Multiple occasions. I've got to say, to be honest, given the lifestyles they were leading, I'm almost surprised that there wasn't more of that. I mean, given how, this was going right through particularly that it was the height of the AIDS era. And if you look at the toll that AIDS and HIV took on disco scene, the house scene, the art scene, it cut a swathe through there. And you think, given the number of people in the metal scene who were presumably around, groupies, unprotected sex, intravenous drug use, cheap tattoos. I think a lot of people swerved the bullet in a pretty major way there. So I was almost surprised, to some degree, there wasn't more of the grim stuff. But like I say, I think if you're going to, what I didn't want to write was just a hagiography. And I think you have to, if you're going to write in a way that's interesting, but also sort of rewarding for a reader, you have to be honest about the sort of underbelly of a scene as much as you are the stuff that you love. And I think, we all know what it is we love about this music. And I say what I wanted to do really to bring it to life was say, well, look, not just what happened, but why did it happen when it did? This scene didn't just come out of the ether. It was 100% a product of the culture of the time, the politics of the time, the economics of the time, the media revolution of the time, the drugs that were going around, the crime that was going around, the way populations were changing, demographics were changing. The more I looked at it, I've been kicking this idea around for about 3 or 4 years. And the more I looked at it, I just thought, you can tell all of these stories through the prism of this one kind of music. And I can't believe that nobody's done it. In a culture where, we're very good at kind of re-examining our popular culture. And, there's people write brilliantly about the most arcane or disposable parts of pop culture. There's brilliant books I've read about, the punk scene, the skinhead scene, the early acid house scene, these brilliant bits of writing where people go very deep on very small scenes. And yet glam metal seems to be this one form of music that is immune to any sort of serious critical reassessment. And why is it you never tend to run into someone who's like, do you know what? I was massively into Dokken. And I was like, well, someone was. A lot of people were. And I just started the book on the hunch that there's a really interesting story there. And there's a lot of people for whom this music was a huge part of their lives. And that story will resonate with them if it's told in the right way and if it's told respectfully and if the music is actually taken seriously rather than just treated as a joke or a relic of a bygone era.
The Booked on Rock podcast will return after this. We talk about MTV's importance, but soon Hollywood's getting involved. Dokken writes a song for Nightmare on Elm Street Part 3, I think. Dream Warriors from 1987's Nightmare on Elm Street Part 3.
Well, that's the other thing that people, I don't think, fully appreciate from this distance, because metal was always happy to portray itself as being this kind of renegade outside of music. The slight dichotomy there was that it always portrayed itself like that, but it was popular to a degree that it obviously wasn't a renegade outside of things. So, like in a really basic sort of idea was, you say someone like Kiss, Crazy Nights, it's a sort of outsider's anthem. These are my people, this is my crowd. It's like, that was a top 10 single. If this is your people, this is your crowd, there's millions of them. All these bands where, and again, when you go back and look at the tour itineraries, it's like, well, you're selling out the biggest stadium in every city you go to. You're not a niche underground concern. However much your fans feel like that, you are huge at this point. You go back to 1983 on MTV, the only song being played more than Billie Jean by Michael Jackson is Photograph by Def Leppard. That's the level that they were punching so high at that point. And, when they make Hysteria, they're completely explicit about that. Joe Elliott says, we want to make heavy metal's answer to Thriller.
They wanted 7 singles.
Off an 11-track album. It's a phenomenal achievement. And I think when you look at where are traces of glam metal still heard now, I think what interests me is, there are still, you can go to Hard Rock Hell or any of these sort of revival gigs. There's like a revival circuit of, you can go and see whoever's legally allowed to trade as LA Guns or Bullet Boys or, whoever. There'll be someone playing. But I think what's more interesting is that something like Hysteria, I think that was so far ahead of its time in terms of production and the way that it was essentially a rock band functioning like an electronic, the way that a house record would be put together. It's almost a complete creation of the studio in the way that Sgt. Pepper or the White Album is a creation of being in Abbey Road. The mixing desk for Hysteria is kind of the sixth member of the band. It's an astonishing technological achievement, but I think the dynamics of that record, you can hear a lot of that in, say, modern EDM. I think you could listen to, say, and it's interesting, like, Taylor Swift has covered Def Leppard songs in the last couple of years. And I think you could listen to something like that kind of thump that, say, like a big Katy Perry record has got. I think you can draw a very, very clear line from what Mutt Lange was doing with Hysteria to what that entire school of kind of Swedish producers who now dominate modern pop music. And again, those guys would have been 11 years old when Hysteria came out. Those records were huge in those countries. So I would almost guarantee that someone like Max Martin, who's essentially created like the modern language of what pop music now sounds like, he's done all those big Katy Perry records, and I would almost guarantee that he was listening to something like Hysteria in 1987, because the dynamic and the force of that record, I think you can draw a very clear parallel between the two things. And I think if you want to look at where does glam metal's influence live on, I think it's more in that. I think it's in the kind of sonics. And then I say at the end of the book, I think if you look at the whole EDM scene, in, say, Vegas in the States, festivals like Tomorrowland in Europe, that really kind of like crass, supersized end of stadium music, I was like, this feels like the modern equivalent of glam metal.
Joe Elliott talked about producing drum beats that were for the big stadiums, and Rick Allen was getting a little too particular with what to do with the cymbals and in between the beats, and Joe Elliott said, Rick, don't worry, man. This isn't jazz. We're not playing for 100 people, and not everybody's going to be listening to every little thing you do. Play for the people that are way up in the seats, way, way, way back.
The process of recording that record as a result, I mean, it just sounds torturous. I mean, actually, after I finished the book, I was talking to a guy over here who's an old music PR and has been around a lot of those 80s artists. And he said they recorded it in Dublin, where a lot of British acts at the time were based for tax reasons. Elton John was there, Spandau Ballet was there, Def Leppard was there at the same time. And he said someone from one of those bands told him a story about being in, I think the bar was called the Pink Elephant, that all these bands used to drink in. It was in one of the hotels. And he said about being in there one evening and Phil Collins from Def Leppard coming in and buying everyone drinks because they'd just been told that 15 seconds of something he'd recorded that day was going to make it to the final edit of one of the songs. He said, it was literally like this sort of dense composite work of just these little fractions and fragments of songs being pieced together into what became the kind of finished whole. It's like sort of weaving a tapestry together. I think probably at enormous costs to their own nervous systems. I think the level to which they worked on that album.
It's still my favorite Def Leppard album, but I'll ask you this, because some Def Leppard fans will say they're more of a pyromania person than a hysteria. Are you a pyromania guy or a hysteria guy?
I've got to be a hysteria guy. I think, certainly in this country, I think the metal scene in this country always had a very ambivalent relationship with Def Leppard. And I think, as Joe Elliott said, they're an English band. They really reinvented as an American band. And I think, particularly from music papers like Sounds, there was always a real degree of hostility that they were seen as having sold out. They were seen as having chased kind of the American market in a way that was slightly unseemly. And I think, there was, through a lot of the 80s, there was a slightly small-time attitude that prevailed, I think, in the metal scene in this country, where it was seen as, wasn't really the dumb thing to try and be too big, in a way that, in the States, for bands like Van Halen, it was like, you want to be as big as possible. And I think Def Leppard had no qualms about trying to be as big as they could be. And I think a lot of the metal scene in this country sort of held that against them. And when you went back and looked at a lot of the coverage they got, it was very, very sniffy about them. And so I think often a lot of people are like, Hysteria is like a pop record. I mean, Chuck Klosterman makes the point in his book, Fargo Rock City, that, if you were an old Def Leppard fan, Hysteria was seen as the record that suddenly, like, all the jocks and cheerleaders at your school were now Def Leppard fans. So it was seen as being something that kind of took the band away from you somewhat. But I think it's a really almost flawless piece of work. And I saw them about 3 months before COVID started, before lockdown. I saw them on that tour where they were reprising Hysteria in its entirety.
What'd you think?
Incredible. I mean, not that they're miming or anything. I mean, they can recreate that studio sound in a way that you really have to be on top of your game to do that. And they sounded so good. They are the visuals of like the stage show and the presentation are great. And again, do you know what? They look like they're enjoying themselves again. And, they had like a rough couple of years where they were a bit out of vogue. They were playing at smaller theatres again. And, that's a big come down after you've had that decade of just killing it in stadiums. And then suddenly you're playing a 2/3 full theatre again and no one's really interested in what you're doing. And, your audience is getting older and older every year. And then I think they probably feel like they're receiving a bit more of the acclaim that they were due now. I think people have reassessed them. I think there's a huge amount of goodwill towards them in this country again now. I think Joe Elliott particularly is, he's just renowned as being one of the good guys.
He's a cool dude, man. He is a cool dude. He loves the history of rock and roll. You could talk music with him.
Yeah, I mean, I have friends who work in record companies and they're like, he comes in and he just basically wants to go to the guy he's a huge glam rock fan, 70s glam, and he just wants to talk to the guy who's doing the obscure box set of old junk shop glam rock singles from the mid-70s and get some, weird promos. But he's a real enthusiast. And, they've had a lot of, particularly I write about it in the book, particularly around Steve Clark's death. They went through, that was an awful tragedy obviously primarily for Clark's family, and on a personal level, it was a tragedy for them. But, they were such a tight-knit band. They'd all come out of Sheffield together. They'd known each other as teenagers, hitchhiking down to Nebworth together to see Zeppelin. And then to see someone who you love very dearly destroy themselves like that in such an awful kind of violent way, I think it must have taken a huge, huge toll on them as a band. And for then fairly soon afterwards, for, their entire genre to suddenly become an outmoded sort of relic of the 80s. And I think the 90s were probably a really, really hard decade for them. And to see them playing, these huge venues again here and selling them out and being well loved, I think you'd have to have a very hard heart to begrudge them that.
They soldiered through it. And you talk about a band that wanted to be as big as possible. They were as big as they could possibly be on that album. 7 singles, as I mentioned, 20 million copies sold worldwide, 12 million here in the U.S., 7 hit singles, including 1 number 1. You got Animal, Women, Pour Some Sugar on Me, Hysteria, Armageddon It, Rocket, and the number 1 single, Love Bites, the ballad. And that we segue into the power ballad. Where do we trace the power ballad back to? Is it Aerosmith's Dream On? Is it Led Zeppelin's Stairway to Heaven?
The one that I'd say is probably the template for it is Dream On. I think Stairway to Heaven is borderline power ballad, but it's a bit too ornate. It's got all the different sections and movement. It's a bit more like, it's a bit too prog. I think as a pure power ballad, Dream On, I think, is a hugely, hugely important record there. As an idea, I think the power ballad was huge importance was it gave these bands a route into radio that they may not have had otherwise. You could play, I don't know, Home Sweet Home could get played by radio stations who weren't going to play Livewire.
That was a surprise. The label didn't even want to put that on the album. I think they had to fight to get that one on because it was not the Motley Crue sound. And at the time, power ballads weren't the big thing, and the label thought it wasn't going to be a hit.
It's an odd record because, again, you go back and listen to it, and I don't think, for a record that was as big as it was, and it's had this long afterlife, it's been covered by a lot of people. It turns up on like American Idol and all these kind of shows semi-regularly. It gets used in kind of like montages for military homecomings and things like that. And I say in the book, it's one of these things where the lyrics are so vacuous, it can kind of be about anything. So it gets deployed, which is kind of the strength of the song in one way, that it gets deployed in all these different circumstances. But going back and listening to it, I thought it doesn't quite hit as hard as I wanted it to, in a way that I think, for me, the ultimate one would be Alone by Heart.
Oh, yeah, I was going to ask you, what is the quintessential power ballad?
It's got to be Alone. I think later on you could maybe go for something like November Rain. November Rain is a top draw power ballad, but again, it's a little ornate. It's 8 minutes. It's got different kind of movements. I think for the pure kind of expression of divorcee heartbreak, I think Alone by Heart is the one for me.
That's an interesting pick. I wouldn't have predicted that. I would have predicted more of a Home Sweet Home or I Remember You. Skid Row was huge.
That's a brilliant record. Yeah. And again, I've got to say, someone else asked me on another interview, they were like, what's the album that you think gets forgotten about or overlooked? I would say the first Skid Row album, I think that is absolute killer start to finish. And I saw them a bunch of times around that point when I was 14, 15. They were such a great band live. I think with what they did with Slave to the Grind, the second album, which I think is really strong as well, makes you think they're one of the few bands that could possibly have moved past the glam era into something, that was more their own thing. It was a much heavier record. It was more, inventive. But I would say I Remember You and I think Alone by Heart. I think I'd put both of them as absolute top drawers. But Skid Row generally, I think, massively overrated and somewhat neglected as a band. But I'd say if you haven't listened to it for a while, for any listeners, just go back and put that first album on again. It doesn't let up. It hits the ground running. And that is just banger after banger on that album.
Poison. You write they were proudly juvenile. They take a lot of hits, but I think they wrote some great, straight-ahead, good-time songs. A couple that stand out. We forgot to mention, speaking of ballads, Every Rose Has Its Thorn, but Nothing But a Good Time. You named the book after the song. What are your thoughts on Poison? Underrated, overrated, rated just right?
I think they're rated just about right. I think with the long career they've had latterly, I think they've settled to about the point where they should have been. I found going back and looking at it, I sort of warmed to them more than I thought I would have done. You know, I hadn't really listened to them in a long while. I went back and listened to it again. I think they were much more knowing than people realised at the time. I think, you know, they were very aware of what they were doing with their image and the references they were bringing in. When I say in the book about them being juvenile, I don't mean that in a pejorative sense. I say in the book, one of the driving engines of pop music through the 80s was what I call boomer divorce energy, which is, you've got the sort of 60s boomer generation. They all hit divorce en masse for the first time, first generation to hit divorce en masse. And they make music that documents that. And at least some great records, but it also gives a lot of the pop music of the time this very adult, gloomy feel. So think of things like, you know, The Boys of Summer by Don Henley, Graceland by Paul Simon, Rooms on Fire by Stevie Nicks. You know, all great records, but they're all quite adult and depressing. Now, when you're 14, which is really who pop music should be aimed at, you don't really want to listen to someone talking about divorce and like, you know, Carly Simon's Coming Around Again is a great record. It doesn't say much to you if you're a 14-year-old boy, in a way that Talk Dirty to Me by Poison very clearly does say a lot about you. And the point I was making was pop music really is supposed to be for and about the concerns of the young. And you can trace that back to, you know, listen to like, you know, Rocket 88 by Ike Turner, or the early Beatles records, or, you know, the first Stones records. It's all about this sort of, how do you feel when you're 14? These are your concerns. It's like, what's happening at the weekend? Who am I dating? Have I got any money? Where can I get my next drink? You know, the beauty of Poison for an audience of 14, 15-year-old boys was they were not going to start talking to you about their divorce. They were not going to start talking to you about, well, you know, life doesn't pan out the way you hope it does, and it's all a bit regretful, and the 60s have gone. They were just going to talk to you about the fact that they had a condom vending machine on their tour bus. And they dressed in the way they did, and they would go around getting their asses kicked in Pennsylvania or wherever. And what the hell, you know, it's all a laugh. And when you're, you know, say, a 14-year-old boy, one of those approaches to life resonates with you a lot more. And it's why, you know, like I'm a 45-year-old man now. I mean, there's much that goes on in modern pop music that I have no interest in. And I'm like, do you know what? It's not for me. It shouldn't be for me. There should always be a chunk of popular entertainment which is there purely for the most knuckle-headed, ignorant, limited horizon kind of 14, 15-year-olds, because we're all that person at one time in our lives. And what you want to hear at that age is, I Want to Be Somebody by W.A.S.P. It's not Building the Perfect Beast by Don Henley.
The book title is Nothing But a Good Time. The spectacular rise and fall of glam metal is out now. So was that a no-brainer to call it Nothing But a Good Time?
Like the most obvious title, and I kicked a few ideas round and none of them really stuck. And then I was rewatching The Wrestler with Mickey Rourke. Brilliant film. And again, very emblematic of that era. You know, what happened to these supersized WWF characters who then crashed when the culture changed. And there's that brilliant scene where Mickey Rourke's character, Randy Robinson, and his girlfriend are talking, they're in a bar, and there's a glam metal track playing, and they're like, oh, you know, God damn it, you know, I love Motley Crue, love GNR, you know, love Jovi, love Van Halen. And then Rourke's character goes, yeah. And then that pussy Kurt Cobain had to come along and ruin everything. And the payoff line, he just says, look, like there's something wrong with just wanting to have a good time. And I was like, and as soon as I saw it, I was like, that's the entire mindset that I'm writing about. And I was saying this idea where this music is kind of trapped in the amber of a completely different cultural era. And it's an era where there was nothing wrong with just wanting to have a good time. And after 1991, things become more complex and nuanced and they work on different levels. But I thought there was something so charming and weirdly optimistic about that period. And so, it's a period where a lot was going very, very wrong with the world. If you're our age and you grew up there, you grew up with the shadow of nuclear war, AIDS, crack cocaine, an economy that was on its back for a lot of the time, in both the UK and the US. And through the middle of it came this coterie of bands that just invented themselves, created this entire scene, and just devoted themselves to this kind of hedonism. And the parallel I make in the book is that I think glam metal now is where I think disco was 15 years ago, in that 15 years ago, disco was essentially a joke. If you said you like disco, people were like, oh, it's like the Bee Gees with their chest wigs out, and it's Saturday Night Fever, and it's some novelty songs. And then this kind of reassessment started where people went, actually, do you know what? When you take away all the ridiculous peripheral stuff, underneath disco was this core of absolutely just nailed on songwriting and musicianship. But there was also a genre that tells you a huge amount about America in the mid to late 70s. It tells you about the gay experience, the African American experience, the Puerto Rican experience. It tells you about the dereliction of New York through that period. Why were there suddenly all these big empty spaces you could have parties in? And I think there's a brilliant book I read about 5 years ago called Turn the Beat Around by Peter Shapiro, which is like a sort of cultural history of disco. And I remember reading that and thinking, I'd like to do that for glam metal, because the way that people used to just say that disco was a joke and there was nothing worth reassessing in it, I feel like glam metal has been treated like that for a very, very long time. And I hope with my book and the oral history book, which is the same name, and a few other things that are going around, I hope that we're at a period who can say, do you know what? There was a lot that was wrong with that decade, but there was a lot that was extremely interesting. And if you look at it seriously, it tells us a lot about how we got to where we are now, both in culture and in society more broadly. And it's worth telling that story again.
I think we should get that name out there, the full name of that book, too. I believe you're referring to, is that the book by Richard Bienstock and Tom Bourgeois? That's the one?
Yeah.
Nothing But a Good Time, the Uncensored History of the 80s Hard Rock Explosion.
That's the one.
We know that Nirvana and the release of Smells Like Teen Spirit was the moment, really, when this whole era came to an end. But was there something prior to that, a sign that this glam band era was coming to a close?
I mean, to a degree, this is obviously, I'm reading history backwards, but I think Nirvana was something of a red herring in that, I bookend my book with both the release of Appetite of Use Your Illusion and Nevermind. They come out within basically a week of each other on the same label. In some ways, that's always remembered then as like, well, that's the death knell for glam metal. In reality, I mean, the actual reality is Use Your Illusion was enormous. I mean, it sold tens of millions of copies. They were still a huge band for 2 years after that, touring around the world. And, my recollection of the time is most Def Leppard fans who I knew were totally comfortable listening to Nirvana and Mudhoney, and vice versa. They were just like big, noisy guitar records again. So it wasn't quite as clear cut as that. The thing that I think is the real death knell for glam metal is much, much earlier. I think it's Appetite for Destruction coming out, which doesn't kill the genre off, but I think it gives it a slow puncture. And it's like a boiler kind of leaking carbon monoxide at this point, because I think that album is such an aggressive back to basics statement of intent that I think as soon as Appetite for Destruction, as soon as people hear that, both in terms of the sound, but also the lyrical content, the sleeve, the ideas in it, everything else around it sounds kind of cartoonish by comparison and somewhat ridiculous. And I think you've then got a period in sort of 88, 89, 90, where everything is suddenly either trying to sound like in Guns N' Roses' image, or there's still a more traditional glam template, and they sound and look kind of ridiculous and soft by comparison. And I remember seeing, by like 89, 90, you got bands like Nelson or whatever, and people are sort of like looking at Guns N' Roses on the one hand, who look like, they've all got hepatitis and they're in punk t-shirts and they're kind of greasy. And then you've got like Nelson, who they've sort of come out of like a shampoo commercial, and it's very hard to compare the two at that point. So I think really the wheels start to come off with Appetite for Destruction in 87. And I think from then it's just a case of when rather than if things are going to fall in on themselves.
Do you remember when you first heard Nirvana's Smells Like Teen Spirit?
There used to be one of the few places, I say pre-MTV, one of the few places you could see metal videos there was a show on at about 1 a.m. on Friday nights on local TV here called Raw Power. It was like 60 minutes of like metal videos and interviews and live clips, hosted by a guy called Phil Alexander, who was the editor of Kerrang at the time. And he's still editor-in-chief of Kerrang. He's absolutely one of the good guys in heavy metal. And they opened the show one week. I videoed it the night before. And they'd opened the show one week with the video for Smells Like Teen Spirit. And I really liked it. I thought, it's great. It's quite poppy. It really slams as a record. But again, my recollection of Nirvana at the time is that a lot of people were somewhat unconvinced by them. And there was a general feeling of, well, they're kind of doing what the Pixies have been doing for the past 3 years. They're a bit, Johnny come lately on all this. And the thing where, we look back on previous epochs of music and all you see is the way that it's been repackaged and reassessed. You see, one of the advantages of being older is you actually remember things from the time. And famously, Nirvana's last show in this country was the Reading Festival in 1992. They headlined the Reading Festival on the Sunday night. It's been released as DVD latterly. Everyone talks about this show. I was there. That show was abysmal. They were clearly in like no real state to be headlining. They didn't appear to have any interest in heading. They were stopping and starting songs. They were a bit all over the place. And the weather was atrocious. I mean, it was just like, proper English summer. It was like sideways rain. There was this force 9 gale. There was this underpowered PA system. So if you were stood where we were about halfway back, every time the wind blew, the sound was just cutting out. And you were sinking into the mud. And people, I think we left after about 45. People were just leaving in droves to get off the site. And years later, that's been kind of recontextualized as, it was this seminal performance. And you're like, I don't know if it was at the time. I think it was, people were more ambivalent about them, I think, at the time. So, and, at the time, there were a lot of good grunge bands coming through. I don't think it was necessarily ordained at the time that they were going to be the big one. I think obviously the way things ended for them somewhat cemented it. But like I say, I worked in a guitar shop at the time. 1991, I was listening to Nevermind. I was also listening to Use Your Illusion. I was listening to A Little Ain't Enough by Dave Lee Roth. I was listening to, which again, very underrated record, I think. Jason Becker's guitar work on that is phenomenal. I'd recommend there's a brilliant, brilliant documentary about Jason Becker called Not Dead Yet, because he's had a struggle with Lou Gehrig's disease for about 25 years now. He's, again, one of the good guys in music. It's a brilliant film about him. It was worth looking. I was listening to the second Skid Row album, still listening to the first Skid Row album, the Def Leppard album, I think Adrenalize, the album from that year.
Yep.
That was getting a lot of play at the time. Again, holds up pretty well with hindsight. It was the post Steve Clark album that they did. That was getting a lot of play. So things were, more kind of varied. It wasn't just as simple as, metal ended and grunge began. The two sort of coexisted quite happily for a while there.
How do you feel people look at the era of glam metal nowadays, particularly the younger fans? I see kids on YouTube who are fans and they're wearing the shirts and they're listening to the music and reviewing albums from that era. Are they the minority, or is this a genre that will ultimately get its due and stand the test of time as the memories of those negative labels fade more and more?
I think, I made the comparison with disco. I think there's a way that you can see it gradually getting a sort of critical reappraisal. I was saying, you've had like Mariah Carey and Taylor Swift and people like that covering Def Leppard songs. I think there's elements of it that you can hear in the production, if not the actual sonics of kind of modern music. I think there's things in EDM that sound very close to it. My hunch, and I could be wrong on this because everything comes round again eventually. I think the thing that's going to make it very hard for it to be fully rehabilitated in a way that punk or post-rock or new wave could be is that it's very one-dimensional. And I think to a modern audience who have a very strong sense of dramatic irony, I think it's very hard for them to look at something like glam metal and not feel like it's a joke. Because I think to explain to a 14 or 15-year-old now, to most of them go, look, this was music that was ridiculous and theatrical, but it took that very seriously. I think it's quite hard to get your head round that if you've grown up in sort of modern pop culture. And that's very, very difficult for people to understand. I think one of the things that may bring it back, and I'm conscious of this, is that almost unlike any other genre, it's never been mined for samples in a way that, disco was largely rehabilitated because people like Daft Punk started extracting bits of it for samples. There's things like Kanye West sampling old King Crimson records. That's often how people end up then going, oh, okay, what's that from? And re-exploring, these things. Hip hop did a huge amount to get people going back and listen to old jazz records again and funk records. Again, people forget, James Brown's stock was very, very low in the mid-'80s. And then, people like Stetsasonic started sampling him, those Tommy Boy records started sampling him, and people sort of went back to the source material. So I think there's possibly an opening there that there's kind of a gold mine of samples that people could start extracting from glam metal, and that may be a way that people then start reappraising it. But as I think it's that as much as the music, I think it's the kind of ideology around it that makes it feel like a relic of the past and makes it harder for younger audiences to always relate to that much.
Nothing But a Good Time, The Rise and Fall of Glam Metal by Justin Quirk. It is out now through Unbound Books. It's available wherever books are sold. Any website that you want to direct people to get a copy of the book?
I would just ask, if at all possible, just support your local independent, because particularly after the last year we've had, those guys are your local independent, your local library. They're doing, sterling work, keeping the show on the road, and every little helps. So if you can support your local independent, then that would be great, but wherever you can shop.
How about social media pages? People can reach out to you through Facebook, Twitter, Instagram.
I'm at Justin D. Quirk on Twitter. So if you ever want to send me interesting bits of glam metal ephemera, old links, old things from your archive, then it's always a pleasure to see them. And you know what? This is a small book from a small publisher, and things like this it's great just to get out there and talk to people. And you work like any writer, you work on these things in isolation. They take a year to come out. By the time they're out in the world, you have no idea of where they end up. So whenever I get a message from someone in, a different continent, a different time zone saying, look, I read the book, I liked it, didn't like it, thought this, it's always great to hear from people. And you work on these things for a long time, and, they go out into the world and they kind of take on a life of their own. So, I just hope that people think I've done the subject justice. I've treated it seriously, but with the affection that I think all true fans of the genre are respectful of it, but aware that it had a kind of ridiculous underbelly. And I've tried to convey both those things in the book. And it's been a lot of fun to work on, and it's been far better received than I could ever have hoped. It's had a really, really glowing reception. So in this country, at least, so I hope with readers on your side of the water, it'll go down as well.
Justin, thanks so much for taking the time out to talk about your book and all these great bands from the 80s.
Listener, thank you. I'm in esteemed company on the show, so thank you so much for having me on. I really, really appreciate it, and all the best for the year ahead.
Thanks to Justin Quirk for taking us through his book, Nothing But a Good Time, The Spectacular Rise and Fall of Glam Metal. As we heard Justin just say, if you have a local bookstore, pick up a copy there and support not just Justin, but your local independent bookstore. A link to find your nearest bookstore is on our website, bookedonrock.com. Subscribe to Booked on Rock at Spreaker or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. We're on Amazon Music, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, Spotify, TuneIn, YouTube, and more. We're also on Facebook at facebook.com/bookedonrockpodcast and on Twitter at bookedonrock. The email address is thebookedonrockpodcast@gmail.com. I'm Eric Senich. Thanks for listening, and join me again next time for another episode of Booked on Rock.